welcome back to Inside Scoop. This is another podcast brought to you by LP Magazine. I'm your host, Stefanie Hoover, and today I'm here with Mike Marquis. And let me give a little preface here. Hey, Mike, how are you?
Good, Steph. How's things?
Good, good. So before I kick it over to you to kind of introduce yourself and give us your background, I wanted to say to the audience that I brought Mike on because I feel like Mike is like this. He's not Rain Man, but he's close when it comes to numbers.
How
Mike
about
is really
that?
good at numbers, and Mike and I have known each other for a little while now. Worked with Mike, and what really impressed me about you, Mike, is that you not only understood the numbers, you knew where to dig in further, and you knew how to put the numbers together in a compelling story to present your case to different folks that you worked with, stakeholders in your organizations. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today with you. And
Sure.
I've got some questions for you, but before we get into all that, tell us a little bit about who you are.
I'm happily retired right now, so I can get away with saying a lot of stuff, I think.
Right, you
But
can.
I,
That's the reason why I wanted you on.
I, I started in department stores, right, as a store detective while I was in school back in the 80s. And I spent some time moving up the security manager at the time ladder. Then I went to work in specialty. Um, and so I worked for a company called J. Baker. They're gone now. And that's kind of a track record, right? My department store, Jordan Marsh, is gone now. J. Baker's gone now.
Mhm.
So there might be a story there, um, but J. Baker was specialty shoes. We bought a big and tall man store. We bought a uniform company while I was there, and went from one of the best small companies in America, according to Forbes, to liquidating in 9 years. So how fast retail can change.
Mhm.
From there, I went to Urban Outfitters, and Urban was really in startup mode. There was like 23, 24 Urban stores and 80 Anthropologie stores. Um, and there it was kind of cool because I worked for the CFO. I had inventory control. I had LP that didn't exist. And I had what today would be called store operations, the functionality of policy and procedure. And sitting in on monthly reviews with the CEO and CFO of each business unit, I got to understand the business in a whole different way. So that was great experience for me. From there, I went out to Ohio for Limited Brands. I spent some time while I had shrink responsibility for the Limited, doesn't exist anymore. There's that trend. And Victoria's Secret, which is still around, so I feel good about that one at least.
Okay, good.
And then I came home, which is New England, right? And I got to move over to TJX. So I spent some time in the Marshalls chain. Had a big chunk of I had the Northeast, I had Puerto Rico, Southeast. Um, and then I retired as AVP of Global Investigations. So we really were at ORC in my world, but I also had what drives shrink globally and how do you identify it and get to it.
Yeah.
So there's a
So
quick summary.
nice summary. I have to say though that with the early retirement, I feel like it's an early retirement that is evidence in and of itself that you know numbers. That you're able to retire so young.
Or you get lucky.
Yeah, whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But so let's start off with this. Thinking back over, your vaunted career, when do you think you first realized that numbers matter? And when I'm talking about numbers, I'm talking about numbers in the business.
Yeah. So maybe a couple of disclaimers, right? So I'll talk about a lot of business stuff, but I'll try to be generic on the business.
Sure.
Um, and then it's not me, Steph. I've worked with hundreds of people that have. I'm a curious guy, right? So you never know where you're going to learn something. Um, when I can convey learnings, right? But there's a whole bunch of folks to be grateful for that have helped me do that. So, but the I didn't know what shrink was as a store detective, right? I was catching shoplifters. I became a security manager, and probably I don't know, 45 days after I was security manager, someone showed me shrink numbers, and I remember looking at them. And our store it was an urban store, 6 floors. It was a pretty big store for the business it did, and we were running 2.1-ish shrink. But I looked at electronics, which at the time was on the top floor with mattresses, and everything was cabled. And it was running a 3.5% shrink. And it made no sense to me. So, being curious, I started asking people questions, and everyone said, "Oh, it's a reconciliation issue." So I got a history of shrink, maybe 3 years, and it was always high. So I didn't understand this reconciliation thing, but I knew that that was bad. And it turned out to be uh, a group of receiving folks that had been killing the store for years. So
Mhm.
the the numbers that were widely accepted that just didn't make sense. So it felt like we should be digging, and it turned into a pretty good investigation. Um, and that, I guess, that curiosity, when so I was at a small startup, and there was 8 stores in the business, and my higher shrink department was wax candles.
Okay.
The hell's going on there,
Yeah, I
right?
was gonna say
So
candles.
exactly right. As an LP person, I'm like, what the heck? What's going on here? And I was in a store in Manhattan, and it was beautifully presented. I was with the director of store ops, and I was with the director of merchandising, and we're walking through the store, and it's just the environment was amazing, and a ton of candles were burning, and it just felt like a really good place to shop and spend a lot of time, which was the goal of the brand.
Mhm.
Um, and I asked where the candles came from, and they said, "Oh, that's we sell candles." I'm like, "Okay, so how do we mark them out of stock?" And the director of ops looked at the director of merchandising, asked the question. She looked at store manager, asked the question. Who looked at the merchant in the store and asked the question. And I fixed my higher shrink category because there was no process to mark candles out of stock.
Oops. Yeah.
So it's really just what sticks out and how do you get to it.
Yeah. I think sometimes with LP folks, at least the ones that I've run into, they're good at their jobs, right? Even from the get-go, are they're curious, they ask questions. If something doesn't look right, don't just accept it at face value, dig in a little bit more. I mean, that's I think how I found my success in my career was always asking why, maybe to the point of being a little annoying.
I have had LP people tell me it's not, they felt like I was interrogating them. I'm like, no, really, I'm just curious why you think that. Because I might be wrong. It's possible. And
Mhm.
it often happened, right? So I could learn. So
Yeah.
100%. I think part of numbers, right, is making things understandable for people.
Mhm.
So if I was in a store traveling a market, we'd try to figure, you had a store manager and they're like, I'm going to fix shrink. Cool. How are you going to do that? I'm going to fix shrink. Oh, awesome. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
So breaking that, every 6 month, every year number down into manageable bites made a difference, I think. So an exercise would do, let's do rough numbers, $20 million store. Maybe they say, we've got I don't know, a 1% shrink, really good I care, 200, so 200K a year, right?
Mhm.
Um, so 200K a year ends up being, if you break it down by day, 360 days, probably, well, this one I know is $555 a day because I've done this math with people before, which is $50 an hour that you're losing, right? So you ask a store manager, how much do you want to lose an hour? And they're going to say nothing. Okay, well, nothing's not realistic, but give me a number, $20. Well, at
Mhm.
1%, they're losing $50. So let's figure out what reality is. And can you give me an extra five? Can you cut it to 45? Right. And if you do the math incrementally at 3%, all of a sudden you're starting to talk about real money. But breaking it down into something that can let a store leader, district leader, department leader, whatever, rally the troops around. Hey guys, we lose $70 an hour. Let's cut it to 60 for the next 8 hours. Really
Mhm.
can help to motivate the sales associate.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for an elevator pitch, not only just about, what it is that you do, right? But it's you kind of have this in your back pocket when you're on a store visit. You should, by the way, have your numbers memorized for that store anyway, right? Not every single number, but high level shrink and your top categories. But to your point, have that story on lockdown so that you can then, get them on board quickly and easily with something they can relate to. I was always impressed when I was on a store visit with you, Mike, as a senior leader, asking questions. Like you don't see that a lot from senior leadership. Hey, just asking a question and continuing to dig. Normally, a leadership walk, it's very cursory, right? They don't really dig. They don't want to embarrass anybody. I don't think you embarrassed anybody, but you did ask questions and got people thinking. And I think it was a really good example for those that were around you on your store walks, for sure.
Yeah, those are again, right? Being curious matters.
Mhm.
I remember one of my first dishonest associate cases when I was in specialty was straight cash theft out of the register. And it
Mhm.
had incrementally gotten worse by the associate. And one of the things I was curious about was why she was doing it, right? Because this was kind of, it seemed really uneducated. And she was a college student at a extremely reputable college.
Mhm.
And I asked the question, she said, well, no one told me that we balanced the registers at the end of the night. Okay, I feel an awareness line coming up, right? But without asking, I never would have gotten to that simple thought process. She was a mid tier or a midday worker, so I never would have gotten it without asking the question.
Yeah. Your point, ask questions of everyone, right? Whether it's
Yeah,
the dishonest associate sitting in front of you. God, they have stories to tell. And I think
they
people are
do.
really missing a huge opportunity if they let that person walk away without really asking stuff that maybe is not on the list, right? It's something that could really affect the operations in that building.
We had a, so we think building, but sometimes it's merchandise, right? So
Yeah.
um, there was a period of time where I had an awareness program where again, it's the whole bunch of people to thank,
Mhm.
had an awareness program around the merchants, right? And let's spend an hour telling merchants what shrink is, how it affects their business, and what they could do maybe to help us out. And,
Mhm.
and that little bit of education, now you've added however many eyes you need. You've got in your merchandising world, you're planning and allocation groups that can maybe pull up a red flag. And we had a young assistant buyer who was curious how to tell this story. So the apparel world had just a hot item selling, and it
Mhm.
was selling across the country except for Metro Washington, D.C. You know, Sterling, Virginia, around Alexandria to Maryland, nothing. I mean, not a single unit was selling, and it made no sense to the merchant.
Mhm.
And she had taken the next step to call the stores and say, "Hey, how many of these do you have on hand?" And they had exact number that was shipped to them on hand, every single store. So she couldn't figure it out. But she
Okay.
thought, hey, the LP people talked about this. Let me give a call and see what happened. Well, it turned out it was an internal fraud ring that was killing us in Metro DC.
Wow.
And they were maintaining their books so they knew exactly what they were supposed to have. So it was eye opening that you can find folks willing to fight against shrink without even knowing it to help their business.
Right.
So
Well, there's a lot of people that are, they have a strong sense of right and wrong, right? You tap
yeah,
into that. So speaking of merchants, I want to kind of get into this with you, but to start off with, do you have a quick and easy way to explain shrink at retail versus shrink at cost?
sure. Um, so general rule of thumb, cost is 50% of retail. That's the easiest way to do it, right? So
Mhm.
shrink at retail. If you sell something, if the merchants buy something and put it on the sales floor for $100 and you sell it, good for you. It's $100. If
Mhm.
it gets stolen, it's $100 in shrink. That's shrink at retail. If you're doing shrink at cost, if it gets stolen, it's $50 in loss. And you're dividing that still against your retail sales. So you're basically cutting your discussed shrink number in half um, compared to a shrink at retail environment. So I've been with companies that have gone through that transition. When a 3% shrink store becomes a 1.7 or a 1.3 or whatever, and all of a sudden, through no process improvements, the team's high-fiving without understanding the change.
Right.
Um, you know, when I was with a company that was basically doubling their LP field, and just in doing interviews with folks, very quickly I realized, boy, something is not alike here.
Mhm.
So you had to. One of the first questions was, "Are you stating shrink at cost or shrink at retail?" And when they looked at you and they were like, okay, we
Yeah.
may be passing here, right? Because you better understand your own numbers before you try to explain them to me. So that's a driver,
Mhm.
but that's in your own company, right? You level off. It's when you start to compare. It's why, candidly, when you're looking at amassed surveys where folks are sending information in, the ability to differentiate between the two and then what margin is for the stores that are doing cost is sometimes the numbers aren't so good.
Right. So what would be the advantage for a retailer to pick one over the other to drill into that
Um,
one?
so the biggest advantage, right, comes with markdown manipulation.
Mhm.
So if I'm thinking about a P&L, I'm thinking shrink and markdowns, add them together, and then figure out what my lost profit is. Because so I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but if you're looking at markdowns, there's a bunch of ways markdowns can happen, right? You can be truly a point of sale business
Mhm.
where the merchandise sits at full retail on the sales floor until it goes through the register. And then the computer tells it how much it's marking it down, and that adjusts the books. You can have a merchant in your corporate office somewhere say, hey, we're cutting this 25%. There's a bunch of reasons why they would do that, but they could cut the ownership of it 25%. And then there are folks that still go out and do, I have to touch the item and mark it down, right? And if I'm supposed to have 10 and I only count 7, the other 3 are going to sit at full retail until I do inventory. So that markdown manipulate, or the ability to manipulate those markdowns can impact a retail shrink environment, less so at cost.
Okay.
Uh, one of the things I would say is if you're in a retail environment, you want to understand unit shrink too. So units sold versus units lost.
Mhm.
Because whether you're adding dollars to that or not, that's a pretty true measurement to comp. And I had the opportunity to um, well, let's think about how to say this one. So we were completely changing a lot of programs, and my boss was concerned that the efficacy and the payback might not be there in what we were doing. So
Mhm.
we did an off-cycle inventory in a couple of high shrink districts, and this just I don't remember the numbers, but just using simple numbers, the shrink went from 3% at retail to 4.5%, and there was general concern that everything we were doing was bad. But when you looked at shrink when you look at unit shrink, you saw that the unit numbers went from 3% down to 1.5 or 1.8, something like that. So the trend on units was right, and you're just dealing with a markdown issue at that point.
Mhm.
So if you don't understand the mechanics of how markdowns affect your inventory value, and then how that lays out to an inventory and then a shrink result, you could be chasing ghosts.
Right. I would
So
think there's an opportunity for some manipulation at higher levels. But let's say, you mentioned folks in the home office doing markdowns. Um, is there an example
yes.
that you have from your? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
um, so merchants that are gold on profitability certainly would rather see um, an inventory where their lost product is accounted for at full retail for shrink, as opposed to marking down shrink.
Mhm.
And I don't have an opinion on what's the right way to do it. Like I say, if you add markdowns and shrink together, then you've got a true profit loss. But I know that if you're watching a cadence of markdowns, so every 13 weeks there are markdowns that occur, and then around inventory, 13 weeks becomes 12, so that markdowns happen the week before inventory, or more likely becomes 14, so inventory is taken and then markdowns occur.
Mhm.
Then you'd want to dig a little bit deeper into what that manipulation might look like and why. It's um, it can really distort, how a person is, how a person's viewed, right? Merchants aren't so good. Sometimes there's a really good reason to mark stuff down, right? You've got, if you're sitting on a $20 million inventory bank that you as a merchant can have, and you need to get some money and you're open to buy, you may want to mark the value of your departments that you manage down 20% to put more money in to go buy something. Understanding the mechanics of buyers and the process of how they have to manage their inventory, because they're managing an inventory by department or by, whatever, jeans, tops, bottoms, shoes, whatever. But they're managing that. It's not like they can just go get whatever they want. And how a business handles where the money's available to buy and how they free that up, and how they have to carry their bank, it can help you better understand some ramifications that no one in the field is going to be able to handle, or have a clue what to do with it.
Right.
So,
So as you're talking, I'm thinking about, okay, so let's say that I'm a district or a regional. How would I start to tap into information like that? Would I be looking at P&L? Would I need to get reports from the home office? Would I stay out of that? Like,
So that feels like more you're going to push that question up, right? Because
mhm,
that's other folks sitting in offices or cubes that can sit down with other people in meeting rooms and say, take me through this process. Because it's not gonna, well, two thoughts, right? One is it's not going to affect a region or a district or a store because it's happening globally across the business.
mhm.
Unless, of course, you're a high shrink store. So we talk this one through a little bit, right? So it, if you're in an environment, I'm going to try to make it easy on myself, that does inventory once a year. Okay, so
Okay.
you're going to do inventories in January, um, and you run a 2% shrink. So if I think about, I should probably put some numbers around this. So let's say you get 10,000 units in your store or in a high shrink department or a low shrink department, I don't care. 10,000 units, and you turn it 7, 8 times a year. Your 10,000 units at year end, because you're losing units as you go, 9,000 units, something like that, right? So
Mhm.
that's yeah, probably 1%, somewhere 8,800, maybe 1.5%. But let's say you're a 3% shrink store. Then as you're coming into your peak selling season, right, Christmas, in that category, that 10,000 units, because you're losing units through the course of the year, you might only have 7,000 units. And if
Mhm.
it's a high shrink store, a high shrink department, you might only have, say at 4.5%, you'd have what, 5,500 units or something like that. So now you're impacting your sales. So that would matter, right?
Mhm.
You'd want to understand um, how they're accounting for units lost. And again, at a retail shrink, markdown numbers will help to drive a difference there. So
Mhm.
hopefully that made some sense.
I'm just thinking about, merchants who might be, could they be dumping goods, into certain stores? No, it's going to be company wide.
Again, it all depends on how a business operates, right? If you have outlet stores where you dump, you know, out of stock stuff into, if you dump it into clearance and then clearance moves off of the merchant's books, um, there's probably 4 or 5 different ways that a merchant can clear space that's really dead inventory because it no longer exists because it was stolen or mishandled or improperly marked out of stock or whatever.
Mhm.
And I candidly, I mean, that's not a good place for an LP person to be. But from a profitability perspective, you want the merchants to have as much money as they can have, and they're open to buy go buy stuff. That's
Right.
so that's a really long-winded explanation for why retail at cost or shrink at cost helps the business operate a little bit better, I think.
I think so too.
So,
Yeah. And I think it's,
but
even if, you said long-winded, but I think it's actually succinct explanation for it, because I think LP folks do need to have a basic understanding of how this works, right? Even if they're not involved in, high-end investigations
sure.
at the home office, they should know how it operates. Um,
If you can go to a store manager and say, "Hey, I can increase your holiday on-hand inventory by 30% if you do these 6 things," I would think they might raise their hand and say, "Oh, that's good because the more stuff I have, the more I can sell."
mhm.
So
Yeah.
I I- I'll tie a few things together. I was on a store tour, and I remember the store clearly. It was Pasadena, California, and I had a store manager said to me, "My women's accessories manager wants to talk to you because they have some serious concerns." I'm
Hmm.
in.
That's
What
always
do you got? So uh, he says to me, "We have a problem with sunglasses. They're getting stolen, and we can't sell them." And I was like, "Yeah, that's an issue in a lot of the, I'll call them tourist stores, high sun stores."
Mhm.
And then he diagrammed out a use deprival um, physical tool that would enable those people that, in his belief, walked in, took a pair of sunglasses, and walked out because it was sunny out, would take their ability to do that away and would drop shrink.
Okay. It's like bleach in
It-
the eyes. Like, what is it?
no, and it was basically a dangler right before danglers exist, right? He was putting
Oh,
something
okay.
across, but he had designed it with stuff that existed in the store in a manner that was, hundreds of a penny per unit in a store over the course of a year. and complete no-brainer, right? The cost of labor for putting it on, not so
Mhm.
much. I mean, there was no reason not to try this in stores with a sunglass shrink rate than say 5%, which was
Okay.
Miami, Southern California. It was all the sunny areas. Radical difference in shrink. Cut shrink in half. I would like to say I look like a genius, but here's a case where, high five to that woman's accessories manager in Pasadena, California, who literally created defined the issue clearly enough and created the solution. And, it helped with the overall bottom line because those big departments matter when you're looking at the overall box.
Right.
So,
That's fascinating for that person to have the wherewithal to, first of all, know that that was a high shrink item. That's battle number one, right? Just being aware, and then watching people and how they behave with the merchandise and
yeah.
trying to come up with a solution for that. Hopefully that person has patented that.
Sadly, no. We did,
Oh,
however, if I remember right, we sent him and his partner on a vacation somewhere. But
okay.
it was pick a place and, because it was real money in those stores. So
Nice. Very nice.
yeah. Yeah, it was one of those we should do something really special for this guy.
Yeah, I love it. So you kind of you touched on this and then we went away from it, but we are talking about the true numbers, right? And now because you're retired, we could have an open and honest conversation about this as much as you want to. I won't prod you too much, but there's this continuing public debate, right? About, oh, the numbers aren't real around ORC and retailers are crying wolf. And it is tough. Like I think the retailers all acknowledge that it's very hard to come up with solid numbers. We do our best, but I just wanted to get your take on that, on the numbers that you've seen and what you think.
Yeah. So a few different thoughts, right? First of all, history, right? So I'm old enough to have worked in an environment where my department store didn't have EAS because it was unattractive. And I had those conversations with divisional presidents into the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
Nah, that's not our culture. Um, I'm also old enough to remember that when you cabled leather coats, it was the death of sales, right?
Yeah.
And now today I look at, you see video of stores in major metropolitan areas where to get in the store, you've got to get buzzed in and everything is behind glass. I mean, it's how far that extreme goes, right? And it's funny because I would often jokingly say when traveling, fill the store with merchandise, take an inventory, lock the doors, come back 6 months later, and you'll be close to 0% shrink. You won't sell anything, but it's a great way not to lose stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't hinder sales, right? You have to figure out a way to what that balancing act is between having stuff to sell and selling it, right? Because if you don't have it, you can't sell it. But if you do, so the I guess the short answer here is ORC is a real thing, not across the board, but in specific markets, specific countries, it's a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to that store manager, if you said, "I'll give you 1% a year," you can lose 1%, which is $50 in that example we used, right? It's $50 an hour you can lose. Don't lose 60, that's bad. Or don't lose 100, that's bad. Um, it, in a market that runs at zero point 0.7, you're going to say, oh, and that person that cares that, had someone run out the door 3 weeks ago with a polo shirt, and that's the only shoplifting that they've seen. But my God, we need guards in the store, right? You don't want to discourage that passion. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to support at that level. Um, but uh, you can't just allow it to become a crutch. Well, the reason why we're running at 6% is because, shoplifting, organized gangs. And I'm not buying that. There's a way to get better. And sometimes it's we need to get better at the store. Sometimes it's we need to get better in process or with whatever tech support you need to do. So there's my disclaimer before I say that if you're running a shrink of 2% and you think that ORC is half your shrink, okay, run a store at half a percent or run a store at 1%, right? Fix your processes
Mm-hmm.
and go aggressively after internal theft and try to hold water on the ORC stuff. And I do believe that there are markets that the water has gotten so high it doesn't make sense to have that opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got the rest of the country to offset part of it, right? And then part of it is, um, the environment, the people, so people living in that type of an environment, there's people, there was a time that I went from 6 stores in New York City to 130, and it was with an acquisition. And I was a New England guy. I ended up moving to Manhattan for 6 months to understand what the environment in New York was, and had to go back and tell the suburban Boston people, yeah, no, that's pretty much a norm. That's not offending anyone down there. It's okay to do that in the city.
Right.
But so sometimes it's changing mindsets. If I were still in the business today, I'd still be talking about we do the best that we can. We try to engage people as best we can. We try to keep our associates honest. We try to hire better people.
Mm-hmm.
And, we better dig into any anomalies that seem to exist in a process, a software flow, whatever. And then we'll live with what those losses are. But the merchants have to understand it. If you're putting the hottest selling pair, so guilty on this one. I was with a company, and in San Francisco, we put the hottest selling jeans within 6 feet of the door. And it was a test buy we had bought maybe for 5 to 10 stores. And we sold none in San Francisco. And when the question was, why aren't they selling in San Francisco? It's because, well, they didn't exist anymore. In fact, within an hour of being in the store, they were all gone. Oops.
Right.
We should do something. We should fix that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but shrink itself it is a mystery stew, right? So there is, you guess at how much you think you're losing to shoplifting. You guess at how much you think you're losing to internal theft. And then you have processes that no one at field level can possibly understand because it's software, right? And a nuance in a software change could screw something up completely. And the victims are the people at the store. So you're always guessing. And what I think has happened over the last 30 years, going way back to the original National Retailer Shrink Survey that Dick did, in the early 90s, maybe. It put numbers out there that started to reinforce numbers in people's heads, and it evolves a little bit. But I don't know that
confirmation bias, right?
100%, 100%, right? And people that grow up in that environment over the last 25 years, now they're getting the surveys to fill out. And there's an example. I don't know how long he sent out a survey without asking about retail at shrink versus retail at cost. And those numbers were just getting blended.
Right. So, not good. Yeah.
Challenging.
Yeah. So I would love to continue our conversation in a part 2, if you're up for it, Mike. I have a lot more things I want to ask you about. But we've kind of come to the end of our time. As I knew we would. I knew this time would fly by. And I hope that folks that listen in are getting a lot from your conversation or our conversation, because I know I am, as always. I always learn something from you. Hopefully you've had fun.
Sure.
If you're out of retirement, sure.
Yeah, feels like work.
Feels like work again. Well, hey, dust the cobwebs off a little bit. That's okay. But thank you again, Mike. I appreciate you coming with me, and we'll talk again soon.